and the investigation of veterans who served in Northern Ireland during the Troubles.
Minister John Penrose.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And can I begin with an apology, because, as everyone will have doubtless observed by now, I am not the Secretary of State for Defence. I don't have her hair. I'm very jealous of that. But I just wanted to explain that the reason why there's been some toing and froing since the terms of the UQ were first became clear in the course of the last hour, and the reason why I'm here is because we have concluded, at least for the moment, that it would be better to try and respond to my honourable friend's comments about soldiers serving in Northern Ireland, and obviously the Northern Ireland Office addresses that directly, particularly because the rules were different when soldiers were serving in Northern Ireland. They were there in support of the police, in support of civil powers, and those are different. Obviously, it's a different legal basis than if they are fighting abroad under other kinds of conflict. And therefore, I will endeavour to be as helpful as I can to my honourable friend about this. If he has any remaining questions which he wants to address, I'm very happy to follow them through with him later on. But let me at least try and address the burden of his urgent question right here as it's asked. And can I start, Mr. Speaker, by saying I strongly agree, and I suspect that everybody on all sides of the House will strongly agree that my honourable friend is absolutely right, that the current system, the current situation in Northern Ireland is not working properly for people on all sides. It is clearly unsupportable and it is unfair in many, many ways. So whether you are a former soldier or a former police officer, perhaps now in your 70s, who is worried about being pursued through the courts for events that happened 30 or 40 years ago, that is a constant worry to you and to your family and to your friends. But equally, if you are a member of a family of a victim of Republican terrorists, where the perpetrators were never brought to justice, there is a great feeling of worry, concern, and a difficulty in moving on all sides of the community in Northern Ireland, which my honourable friend is absolutely right, has to be addressed. And that is why, Mr. Speaker, not just the government, but also I think I'm right in saying that parties on all sides of this House and right the way across Northern Ireland believe that a new approach is absolutely vital to put this right. And that's why the original Stormont House agreement was announced some years ago now, and why most recently we have been running a consultation on views about how that could be taken forward. There were over 17,000 responses to that consultation, Mr. Speaker, which I think shows both the depth and the breadth and the intensity of concern about the current situation. We have almost, or pretty much have finished going through those returns to the consultation, and some trends are starting to emerge. We will, of course, bring those to the House as soon as we decently and responsibly can. But I think that one thing is clear to everybody, which is this, that everyone agrees on the aim. The difficulty here is that after, in some cases, 30 or 40 years later, after some of the events in the Troubles, we need to have a process which may have a judicial element, I'm sure it will, but will have to be broader than just judicial, which will allow all sides of the community in Northern Ireland to establish the truth where it can be established, but also which is fair to all sides in the community of the community in Northern Ireland, and which will allow people to move on, where they will feel that society as a whole can draw a line and move on. And while comparisons cannot be exact because the situation in Northern Ireland is unlike anything else on the planet, this has been done in other societies, famously, for example, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa. That won't work precisely in Northern Ireland, clearly not, but some equivalent process, something which aims at the same outcomes, which allows people to feel that justice is being achieved, that truth has been delivered wherever it can be, and that closure can be achieved for all sides on an equal basis wherever possible, is essential. That matters particularly for soldiers who were serving in Northern Ireland, also for police officers who served in Northern Ireland, but also for the families and the grieving loved ones of victims as well. I will endeavour to respond to my honourable friend's further questions. I'm sure he has many, but I hope that at least helps to set the scene about where we are at the moment.
Well, Francois.
Thank you,
Speaker, I'm very grateful to you for allowing this in the queue this morning. There's been a great deal of media speculation over the last week about both what the MOD want to do and the NIO want to do, but yet we've had no information given to the House. So I put in the UQ this morning to try and achieve some clarity, and we'll see how we get on, sir. The Secretary of State for Defence gave a very confident and front-foot speech at Roost yesterday. I was in the audience. Frankly, it was an excellent speech. And she mentioned in her remarks her intention to try and provide legal protection, particularly for veterans who had served in the campaigns in Iraq and Afghanistan. And we have seen articles in the Times and elsewhere to that effect, but thus far, I'm afraid, sir, we've had no specific details. If the press reports are accurate, then what the MOD are aiming towards is something along the lines of a statute of limitations, perhaps 10 years after a conflict has ended, in which no prosecution would be possible unless further exceptional or compelling evidence were to come forward. If that be so, the Defence Secretary would be honouring the Conservative Party's 2017 manifesto, which makes a nice change, and I quote from the manifesto, "We will protect our brave armed forces personnel from persistent legal claims which distress those who risk their lives for us, cost the taxpayer millions and undermine the armed forces." That is as plain as a pikestaff, Mr. Speaker. So if the Defence Secretary is going to do this, well and good, but we'd like more details. And one of the reasons this is so pressing is in terms of the persecution of Iraq veterans. The MOD set up something called IHAT, the Iraq Historical Allegations Team, which spent years looking into these cases. But unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, it became a racket. A number of law firms, one in particular, the ironically named Public Interest Lawyers, led by an appalling man called Phil Shiner, trawled Iraq to encourage people to come forward to make false allegations. Basically, they made some of it up. This all came out in a court case when the trial collapsed. They admitted they'd fabricated evidence, and as a result, my honourable friend and fellow member of the Defence Committee, the member for Plymouth Moor View, conducted a subcommittee inquiry of the Defence Committee into IHAT, which showed it was so shocking that the then Defence Secretary, the Right Honourable Member for Sevenoaks, shut it down. So we must, I'm sure the whole House will agree, never do that again. We then turn to Northern Ireland. And as the Minister rightly said, and as the Minister knows, I have a great deal of time for him, but perhaps slightly less time for his department. The Northern Ireland Office, under the Stormont House Agreement with parties in Northern Ireland, agreed to establish so-called legacy institutions to look into the past. The NIO's interpretation of this is that they will set up some form of commission that will go back to 1968-9, so 50 years, Mr. Speaker, and re-examine every fatality again. That's something like 3,500 cases. So any serviceman, any member of the RUCGC who fired a fatal shot will be re-investigated, but the alleged terrorists will not. Because under the Good Friday Agreement, Tony Blair gave them so-called letters of comfort, which means they are immune from prosecution. No alleged terrorist who's ever been given one of these letters has been successfully prosecuted. The nearest we came was the alleged Hyde Park bomber, and when he produced his letter of comfort in court, the judge abandoned the trial and declared an abusive process. So this entire process would be utterly one-sided because service personnel and members of the RUCGC would be liable to prosecution. Those with letters of comfort are scot-free. Now, Mr. Speaker, after the appalling, tragic events in Londonderry, we all want to see the Northern Ireland Executive re-established. Of course we do. But that cannot be at the price of some rancid backstairs deal between the Northern Ireland Office and Sinn Féin IRA to sell Corporal Johnny Atkins down the river as the price of re-establishing the executive. Up with that, sir, I believe this House will not put. We have a moral duty to defend those who defended us, and we abrogate that duty if, for reasons of political convenience, we allow the scapegoating of our veterans to pander to terrorists. So I wish to ask the Minister 6 very specific questions, Mr. Speaker.
Challenge is to do so before the right honourable gentleman reaches 6 minutes, because he's brilliant, but he's no more addicted to brevity than I am. Mark Francois.
Mr. Speaker, we are both addicts. Question 1. I know it's not his department, but could he give us some indication of when the MOD will provide more details to the House of their proposals? Question 2. When will the Northern Ireland Office publish the response to the consultation on legacy issues that the Minister referred to? Question 3. Can the Minister confirm that a bill will be required in order to set up these legacy institutions, or as I call it, IHAT Mark II? 4th, what discussions have taken place between NIO ministers and civil servants with Sinn Féin IRA on this issue? And is it true, is there any truth in the rumours that they have demanded the continued investigation of British veterans as a price for re-entering the executive? 5, when will the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland come to the House and make an oral statement to update us on these plans so that members can question her in detail about what the NIO proposes? And 6th and lastly, what would he say to Royal Marine David Griffin, aged 78, who I met on Monday, who is being reinvestigated for a shooting in 1972 for which he was investigated and completely cleared at the time? And if he wants to discuss it with Mr. Griffin in person, would he be kind enough to go down to the Royal Hospital at Chelsea, because that's where he now lives?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I will endeavour to respond to those 6 points in order if I can, but can I begin by saying that I'm sure that my honourable friend speaks for everybody in this House. He certainly speaks for me when he says we will have no rancid political deals here. That is not acceptable, and it is something which, if we are going to ask people to potentially put their lives on the line to serve in Her Majesty's Armed Forces anywhere in the world, then we need to make sure that we are doing the right thing by them when they have done the right thing by their country. Now, that isn't as he will also understand, as somebody who has served and will understand the importance of military discipline, that is not an unqualified thing, because there are rules within the armed forces. But providing people have adhered to those rules, then we in this place, on all sides of the aisle, and more broadly across society, owe something in return. And so, therefore, yes, absolutely, there will be no rancid political deals under my watch, and I'm sure that he will be absolutely certain to make sure that cannot happen more broadly. Can I also put him right on a couple of other bits as I come to his 6 points? His point about whether or not the Secretary of State announced a statute of limitations or intention to move towards one, he is right that the details have not yet been fully put out. As I understand it, there will be a consultation with more details attached to it, and certainly some of the press reports are talking about a presumption of non-prosecution rather than statute of limitations. We will have to wait and see. And in answer to his first question about when will the MOD publish details, I'm afraid I can't answer that as a minister in the Northern Ireland Office. I would imagine that they will want to move forward with that fairly briskly, but I'm afraid he will have to ask that either privately or at the next defence questions in order to get a categoric answer to it. On Monday, exactly. He also made a point about the letters of comfort which were issued by previous government. And I just wanted to reassure him and other members of the House that there have been legal reports issued on those letters of comfort since the cases that he's been talking about, and they have said that they are not an amnesty from prosecution. And if a case can be made, then the letters of comfort will not in future be a body armour against a prosecution. Now, he's also right to say we will have to wait and see how that plays out when or if one of them comes to court, but that is the latest and strongest legal situation that we have. Can I now move on to his, well, of the 6 questions, I think I've answered the first one. Let me try and move on to the others if I can. He said, when will we publish the responses to the consultation, to which we've had 17,000 responses? As soon as we decently can, Mr. Speaker, we are very nearly there. It has taken a very long time to go through those responses, and as everybody here, I'm sure, will appreciate, they come from people with stories of tragedy to tell, and therefore they needed to be gone through with a degree of respect and care. I'm sure everyone would expect that to be done. So that it has taken some time to go through that process properly and to honour that, honour the reasons why people wrote in. We are very nearly at the point where we can, and we will bring those forward as soon as we decently can. He asked, will a bill be required as and when we come up with proposals in order to put new legacy arrangements in place? And the answer is almost certainly yes, and therefore the House will have an opportunity for full scrutiny in the normal process, which I suspect was the reason why he was asking the question, but it will mean therefore that everybody has a chance to ask the detailed questions about how this thing is being put together and vote on it, and to confirm that as he and I both agreed, no rancid deals have been done as well. Very important point. Has Sinn Féin IRA, as he characterised them, demanded a price in the talks? Not to my knowledge at all, but I think that goes back to his point on the no rancid deals. And when will the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland make a statement on our plans? And I think the answer to that one is as soon as we have had a chance to discuss this in some detail with different parties, both in Northern Ireland and I think here, because I hope he and everybody else here will understand that while there is agreement on the direction, on the outcome which I think everybody wants to see, the details of this matter. They matter hugely. There are real concerns, for example, he gave some examples of them, about the initial set of Stormont Agreement proposals for dealing with legacy. There are many other examples he could have given about other concerns around that, and we have to deal with those and come up with proposals which work in detail and have acceptance from all sides of the community in Northern Ireland. And I think it is worth our time, I think it's worth everybody's while, to take a little bit of extra time now to get those details right and to come up with a process which everyone can live with to do the detailed design work, the pre-legislative scrutiny, if you like, in order to get that essential work right. So as soon, I think, as we decently can, but I hope people understand that this is something which, because of the sensitivities, because of the precision which will be required in order to come up with something which, after decades, will stand the test of time and of warring views within Northern Irish society, has to be robust and therefore has to be considered with enormous care in the way that it is put together.
Thank you. Tony Lloyd.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister began very early on, and quite rightly, by talking about victims. Victims, those who were killed unlawfully, the families of those victims who, even these years on, still seek truth, still seek to know what happened to their loved ones. And as a matter of record, I know the Minister will confirm this, the overwhelming majority of the killings that took place in Northern Ireland were committed by paramilitaries, Republican or Loyalist paramilitaries. Terrorists, and I'm very happy to join the Honourable Member Fraley in using that word, and therefore by definition illegal, and therefore by definition in need of investigation where there can be no bar because of the passage of time. Every serving soldier who swears an oath of allegiance to Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II and to observe and obey all orders of Her Majesty, her heirs and successors, and of the admirals, generals and officers set over that particular officer. It should be axiomatic that when a soldier has obeyed those Queen's regulations, acted within the orders set out, that individual soldier should be protected from vexatious attacks, and that's legitimate whether in foreign fields or in the context of Northern Ireland. But, Mr. Speaker, I've got to say to the Minister, and I'm not sure he wants to disagree with me on this anyway, I've got to say to him that it is very hard for me to recognise that when a soldier has broken that solemn oath of allegiance to the Queen, the solemn oath to uphold our laws, and wilfully breaks that, leading in the death of individuals, that is something that should be put beyond time for investigation. I think we have to be very clear that in this House that investigating the most serious crimes, where death has taken place, crimes, we have to be resolute and absolute in saying there can be no statute of limitations. Crime is crime. Murder is murder, and we need to establish, as a House, as a nation, that our principles uphold the rule of law, uphold not simply our international obligations, uphold our moral obligations. Now, in that context, can the Minister confirm this specifically, that the PSNI now and any other investigatory body will, by law, be enjoined to investigate those most serious crimes, whether committed by Republican terrorists, loyalist terrorists, or those in the police service or the army who willfully have broken our laws? Because that's the important distinction. The important distinction, protection for those who legitimately carried out the Queen's orders, protection from vexatious claims, that's absolutely right and proper. We should establish that. But no protection for those who willfully broke our laws.
Minister Penrose.
Mr. Speaker, I think that the Right Honourable Gentleman is making a central and uncontroversial point, but I think we need to be very careful in how we approach it, because he has to be right, doesn't he, that outright crimes such as murder must be pursued, and they must be pursued even-handedly. And I think in defence of my honourable friend from Rayleigh, I don't think that he is suggesting anything else. In fact, when I was saying earlier on that military discipline means that the duty that we all owe to members of Her Majesty's Armed Forces is not an unqualified one. It is, that there are limits to it for people who may have failed to follow the orders they were given or failed to act in the right way. But that we need to be careful about being resolutely even-handed about it. And the difficulty which I think one of the many difficulties which many people have about the situation currently in Northern Ireland is that it is extremely difficult to mount effective investigations into many of the deaths that were committed. And he rightly said that the majority of deaths occurred were originated from Republican terrorists. And it is therefore very difficult in many cases to find enough evidence to make those cases stand up in court. So it isn't necessarily a question of prosecuting authorities not trying to be even-handed. They have to be able to follow evidence that is available to them and see whether or not there's a decent case. And the fact remains that the government is a great deal better at maintaining records 30 or 40 years later than perhaps the IRA were at all. And therefore it is extremely difficult to pursue some of those cases. That is why, that's the major reason at least, may not be the only one, but it's one of the major reasons why, to many eyes, the ratio of prosecutions is as skewed as I think he was trying to mention. And that is the concern that people have. But I can reassure him, and I'm sure everybody else here would reassure him, that it has to be everybody's intention to pursue cases where there is evidence on a completely even-handed basis. But we need to make sure, obviously, that we deal with all those other ones, and that is why we have to have a process which is broader than just judicial and allows people to get to the truth insofar as it ever can be at this late stage, and to move on with their lives and to draw a line under a pretty terrible series of episodes in Northern Ireland's past.
Sir Desmond Swain.
Interest to declare as having served in Iraq. But with respect to his consultation, what trend has emerged in the views of veterans of the Royal Ulster Constabulary, and might we be surprised by it?
Simple as that one, Mr. Speaker, is I'm afraid I haven't seen a breakdown. The breakdown is only, the analysis is only just starting to emerge now. I haven't seen anything which breaks it down by in the way that he describes. So I'm afraid I can't give him a factual answer to that. Once the results are out, I'm sure people will pour through them. We may then be able to come up with an answer to it. My apologies that I can't come up with a solid factual answer to him at the moment.
Kirsty Blackman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Minister for coming to answer this question today. Mr. Speaker, we acknowledge the challenges that come with military service, and it is the case that we need to be sensitive to them, and we need to recognise the volatile circumstances that came with serving in Northern Ireland during the Troubles. but nobody is above the law. Mr Speaker, the Good Friday Agreement remains today incredibly important, and we've got a duty to defer to the frameworks underneath it. David Cameron, when he was Prime Minister, gave a formal apology for the events of Bloody Sunday, and he said what happened at Bloody Sunday was unjustified and unjustifiable. It was wrong. I would suggest, Mr Speaker, that it's reasonable, having acknowledged this, that we determine whether anyone is culpable of criminality for the events of Bloody Sunday. Is the government committed to ensuring that those who've lost loved ones on all sides of the conflict have got the means to pursue both justice and truth?
Yeah, yeah.
Mr Speaker, the straightforward answer to that last question is yes. The question, and I don't think there is any disagreement on any side of the House about that central aim. The question, of course, and I think it's inherent in what she was asking, is the details of how. And so, therefore, once we've got a chance to reveal to or announce to the House what the results of the consultation will be, we then need to start work on the detailed reactions to that consultation in order to formulate a bill which will be acceptable to deliver what we're all talking about in a way which works for all sides of the community in Northern Ireland. And on the point about Bloody Sunday the cases, she will be aware, of course, that the Director of Public Prosecutions has recently announced that, having reviewed all the various different cases there, all but one of them will not be taken forward. There is not enough evidence, and therefore for any sort of reasonable prospect of a prosecution, and therefore all but one of them have been therefore withdrawn.
Bob Stewart.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I completed 7 tours in Northern Ireland, all with the infantry or associated units. I lost many men, and I was involved in fatality shootings. I was investigated, along with others. The investigations were thorough, aggressive, and bloody awful to go through. When the investigations were completed, we sometimes had to go to court to prove that we'd acted in accordance with the yellow card. Yep. I told 2 soldiers in 1978 who were with me that because they'd been to court and been proved innocent and acted within the law, they would never ever be asked to do such a thing again. How the hell can our government allow such people to be possibly investigated again?
Well, Mr Speaker, I think the entire House understands, and particularly my honourable and gallant friend speaks with huge authority, given his personal background and experience in the armed forces. And I think the whole House will understand the examples he just gave are a specific and very good illustration of my earlier comments in response to the initial question from my honourable friend from Rayleigh about why the current situation is not working properly for anybody. We need to get to a point where, unless there is some brand new and credible piece of evidence which changes the situation, but in most cases that is not true, that is not the case.
But they asked them to come and give evidence.
Exactly. So unless there is something which is brand new, which was not available at the time, and in the vast majority of cases that is not the case, then at that point people should be entitled to consider that they do not have to face further pursuance through the court. And therefore, Mr Speaker, my point is we have to get this sorted, and we have to get it sorted soon, and we have to come up with a process which works for all the different sides of the equation, as I laid out in my earlier in my initial response. I guess what I'm saying is we are in violent agreement on this. My honourable and gallant friend is illustrating forcefully and absolutely accurately why the current situation is not acceptable, is not and cannot be allowed to stand.
Jim Shannon.
Mr Speaker, thank the Minister for his response so far. Could the Minister explain what the fundamental difference that there is between soldiers following orders in uniform in Afghanistan and Iraq and soldiers following orders in uniform in Northern Ireland, other than a militant Republican drive to rewrite history, to make it seem as if their bloodlust against Captain Arak and the 3 Scottish soldiers and all of those other men and women slaughtered by evil people was in some way acceptable? We must, Minister, have equal treatment for all who served in army uniform, wherever it was or is in the world.
Well, Mr. Speaker, can I start by saying that I think everybody, again, and I certainly would agree with the underlying premise of the Honourable Gentleman's point, which is that we need to make sure that we're doing the right thing by our armed forces, and the difficulty, the legal underpinnings, of course, of soldiers serving abroad versus soldiers serving in Northern Ireland in support of police. The legal difference is important, and it means that our route to arriving at the goal he wants to get us to, and I want to get us to, has to be a different one. So therefore, Mr. Speaker, to take a specific case in point, people who suggest that we should have some kind of a statute of limitations for forces that have been serving abroad need to realise that if we try and do that in the UK, that statute of limitations, according to human rights law, would have to apply to all sides of the conflict in Northern Ireland. And the Northern Ireland letters of comfort, as I've already said, do not stop prosecutions under the latest legal guidance. So therefore, we have to come up with something which gets us to the point that he's trying to illustrate, but it's got to have a different legal foundation to it. I wish it was simpler. I wish it wasn't the case, but it is. And we have to take the world as we find it. And that should be an explanation about why it's hard, but not a satisfactory justification for not trying and not getting there, and not getting there soon.
Mr. Mike Penning.
Mr. Speaker, can I say to the Secretary, the Minister of State, I have every sympathy with these positions down at dispatch force, because I did exactly the same and had exactly the same advice, which was fundamentally wrong when I was in the Northern Ireland office as well as the MOD. When I came back from Northern Ireland, and like many colleagues I served in Northern Ireland, when I came back I was given a General Service Medal. I was on operations. To us it was no different in peacekeeping there than peacekeeping anywhere else in the world. That's what British Army soldiers do. So to stand here and say there's a legal difference between a soldier going on ops in Iraq or Cyprus or anywhere else in the world and going to Northern Ireland is fundamentally wrong, and that advice I challenged and challenged and challenged. How on earth have we got into this position where we won't defend our own soldiers because of some technicality that we weren't on ops? We're on ops, and we were defending the public, and our guys were killed. And I will not have terrorists put in the same breath as British soldiers.
Mr. Speaker, I couldn't agree more. The only point where I would pull him up, and he has stood here and stood in my shoes on this point, as he rightly pointed out, is that he is, I'm sure, right that to anybody serving in Her Majesty's Armed Forces, whether they are serving in peacekeeping operations, they were serving in Northern Ireland or in other parts of the world, the practical effect will feel the same. He's absolutely right, I'm sure, and he's given a medal for it. He rightly points out the practical effect may feel the same, but the legal underpinnings, again, I appreciate he contested this, but the legal underpinnings are different. And while we may wish it were not so, it is so. And therefore, what we have to do is come up with something which will withstand the kind of legal challenge which my honourable friend from Rayleigh rightly pointed out. There are people out there who will try and knock legal holes in any answer that we come up with unless it is legally robust. So we have to acknowledge the legal difference, and we have to find an answer which works, even though we are trying to get to the same answer in each case. And if we can't do that, then we may come up with something which sounds great when we announce it, but it will get legal holes knocked in it, and we will not be protecting our veterans in the way which everybody here wants us to be able to do.
Jenny Chapman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I represent Darlington, which is the nearest large town to Catterick Garrison, and I have many hundreds of veterans living in my constituency. None of them have ever asked or expected to be treated any differently or above the law in any situation, but there is deep concern about this issue, and there is deep concern in the wider community that individual soldiers may be held responsible for failings that they alone do not own, and that a lack of preparedness or a lack of understanding or anticipation of the context in which they would be serving at the time may have led to certain things happening that they as individuals could be held responsible for. And there's a real deep worry about this. Can the Minister assure me that individual veterans in my constituency won't be held responsible for actions that they alone are not responsible for?
Well, Mr. Speaker, that is precisely why we need to come up with these proposals as fast as we can. I think that it's clear from all sides of the House that the time for action is, well, it was probably several years ago actually, but it is now. This is something which cannot be allowed to persist. And the example she gave is only one of a whole spectrum of different concerns, depending on which part of the community you talk to in Northern Ireland and who you talk to in the UK. But it is absolutely valid, and we cannot allow this to continue. We will come back to this as soon as it is decent to do so, and I mean by decent, I mean so we've got a chance of actually getting something that is practically going to work, rather than something that just sounds good in a soundbite. We need to make sure this thing works under legal challenge.
Sir Henry Bellingham.
Is it not ironic that throughout the whole Brexit process we've been bending over backwards to treat Northern Ireland the same as the rest of the UK, but we're now about to treat Northern Ireland differently? Now, I understand the sensitivities of the Good Friday Agreement and the Stormont House Agreement, but surely, with robust and strong leadership, this can be sorted out. And can I put it to the Minister? No other country in the world would treat their veterans in this way. Right. And the Minister goes on about taking more time and going through this and that. All this time, veterans, including in my constituency, are suffering.
Hear, hear.
Mr. Speaker, absolutely right. And I certainly didn't want to imply that we're sort of countenancing being leisurely here. This is something which has been wrong for many years. The only reason for not announcing something tomorrow is because, or today or yesterday, is simply that we need to make sure that we have got all the answers for the consultation out and in front of the House, and that people have a chance to work through the details about, all right, what does this mean in practice then? We need to move as fast as we can, but it has to be as fast as we can, which in a way that is consistent with forging a consensus in Northern Ireland in order to make sure that whatever answer we come up with sticks and survives and works for both sides of the community. Otherwise it will come unravelled in the fullness of time, and we will have failed to protect our forces, our veterans, from the kind of problems which we've all heard about and which I think everybody here agrees are absolutely unacceptable.
Mr. Carmichael.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Right Honourable Gentleman from Raleigh and Wickham is quite right when he says that this question really ought to be answered by the Secretary of State for Defence, because it is her intervention that has left the government with a policy that is totally lacking in any coherence. Quite apart from the inconsistencies that others have highlighted this morning, we understand from the Secretary of State for Defence to be taken from, or they are to disapply the European Convention of Human Rights in this area. Is that government policy that the Secretary of State for Defence speaks of? And if it is, where does the Minister, as a Minister of State in the Northern Ireland office, think that leaves the Good Friday Agreement?
Mr. Speaker, let me address his point about the Ministry of Defence or the Northern Ireland office to begin with. He is, of course, right that the Ministry of Defence has a major stake in getting this right. And as he would expect, and as everybody would expect, the Secretary of State for Defence wants to make sure that this is going to be dealt with as promptly as possible. But the Ministry of Defence isn't the only department that has a stake in this as well, because clearly there are former police officers in Northern Ireland, members of the PSNI, who also could be vulnerable to this kind of predatory legal attack or whatever it might be, and we need to make sure that they are properly dealt with too. So he's right that MOD is a vital part of this, but they aren't all of it, and that's why it goes broader than just members or veterans from Her Majesty's Armed Forces. On the point about human rights, I mentioned earlier on that at the moment all we have to go on are the press reports and the outlines of Secretary of State for Defence's proposals. I did not see, and I don't think she meant, anything to do with contradicting the human rights at all, and it is clear that anything that we come up with, if it is going to be legally robust, has to be compliant with Article 2 in human rights terms, because if we don't have a process which is compliant with Article 2, then we will have failed to protect our veterans, whether they are members of the former members of the armed forces or former members of the police service of Northern Ireland, and if we fail to protect them from proper legal challenge because we have designed a process which is not compliant with Article 2, then we will have failed in our duty and we will have failed to deliver what everybody here, on all sides, wishes to achieve.
Victoria Prentice.
Mr. Speaker, I understand that the Legacy Inquest Unit is powering through its work. Can I urge the Minister to consider the timescale for inquests while considering what other body he's going to set up? And also urge him to make sure that veterans are properly supported throughout the inquest process. To most people, an inquest looks like a court and smells like a court, and it's very important that they're helped through this.
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend makes a very important point. If people are facing current cases, regardless of whether or not we wish to design an alternative process, which may mean that in future many of them will not have to go through that process, and I think everybody here agrees that that would be sensible where it is possible and appropriate. But for those who do, then we need to make sure there is proper legal support, absolutely, and I would regard that as absolutely part of the kind of duty that we owe our former soldiers and other members of our armed forces that I was talking about earlier on in my earlier replies.
David Perkins.
Speaker, the Minister is talking about as though this is something that has landed on him from a clear blue sky without any expectation that it might arrive. But actually, we're talking about events that happened 40 years ago, and much of this could have been predictable. Will the Minister confirm that, whilst of course we want to see those malicious cases dismissed, confirm exactly what his policy is in terms of cases which may have some legitimacy but which have already been tried and we would expect soldiers to be treated fairly within?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I can reassure him that this is not an issue which has landed on anybody's desk in the Northern Ireland office out of a clear blue sky. It is something which has been taking up a very large proportion of everybody's care and attention. I think it was probably fair to say that it was doing so under former Labour governments as well as the current government, and indeed under the coalition government as well. So it isn't, I think. Well, it certainly isn't a new problem, and it is something which clearly has defeated successive attempts to solve it, which is why we have to proceed with care, but as fast as possible with care. In regards to people who have already faced cases, then clearly we need to make sure that they are treated fairly within the law. I'm afraid, bearing in mind the Speaker's Mr. Speaker's earlier strictures, I probably shouldn't comment on individual cases, but I'm sure everybody here would sign up to the notion that, yes, clearly everyone should be treated fairly within the law.
James Heapy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I deployed to Afghanistan twice, and to Iraq, and to Northern Ireland, all in quite quick succession. I can tell the Minister that I received operational training, operational kit, I carried operational rules of engagement, I received operational pay, and I received an operational medal for all 4 of those tours. So this distinction, that as a soldier you are aware of the legal premise on which you are deployed, is not true, it is not fair, and it stinks. Troops do not get to choose whether they deploy on an operational tour because of the legal underpinning that the government has chosen, and it is unreasonable to assert that now. We must limit their liability immediately.
Mr. Speaker, I completely agree, and I was trying to make this point, but let me sort of have another crack at it in response to a couple of the earlier points as well. The practical impact for members of Her Majesty's Armed Forces serving on the ground, no matter where they are, if they're on similar kinds of operation, the practical effect and the feel of those operations will be the same. My honourable friend, my parliamentary neighbour in Somerset, is absolutely right to make that point. And it is not an acceptable justification for inaction for any government to say, therefore, the legal basis is different and therefore we can't solve this. All I'm saying is that the legal solution has to be different because the legal basis is different, even though soldiers may not care or worry about it. Because if we don't take that legal basis difference into account, then the answer we come up with will not work in protecting them. And we want to protect them properly, we want to protect them successfully, and if we don't do that, then the first malicious prosecution that is mounted in a court and knocks a hole in it will show that our efforts have been in vain. So he's absolutely right. This is an explanation about why it's different. It is not a justification for not acting, and nor is it a justification for not succeeding in coming up with an identical outcome even though it's got to be based on different legal foundations.
And Christian Matheson.
Chester is a proud garrison city, and I'm proud to represent many ex-services and serving service families, and many of those have raised their concerns with me. The concerns generally twofold. First, that these prosecutions or investigations seem to be arbitrary fishing investigations, and I say that investigations are just as stressful as prosecutions. And secondly, the right honourable gentleman from Rayleigh and Wickford talked about rancid deals. Of course there was a deal. Of course, when the Good Friday Agreement took place, of course a deal had to take place. But my constituents' concern is clear. That deal should be applied equally and fairly to all sides.
Mr. Speaker, equally and fairly to all sides has got to be our watchwords for the outcome of publishing the results of the consultation and the process of coming up with a bill which works. It's got to be equal and fair to both sides, otherwise it will not endure, otherwise it will not work, otherwise it will not protect our forces in the way that we all want to see it done.
Mr. Douglas Ross.
Mr. Speaker, as the MP for Murray, I represent a large number of veterans, and I share their disgust at the way they have been treated by this government. The Minister has been very fulsome in his answers today, but when speaking about future legislation and the results of the consultation, he said soon, very quickly and shortly, but no specific time frame. When can my constituents and people across the United Kingdom expect to hear from the government about the future plans, specific dates and times to ensure we can keep and hold this government to account on their promises?
Mr. Speaker, I wish I could give my honourable friend a specific date. We are trying to get through this as fast as we can. I hope people understand why, with 17,000 responses, as I mentioned earlier on, each one telling a story of personal tragedy, we needed to make sure we were honouring the sense in which those were provided. But having worked through that, we need to move at pace, and we will endeavour to do so. I can't give him a precise date today. But I will undertake absolutely to take back to the department the very, very clear message from today, which is we need to get on with this, we need to move as fast as we can, but we need to make sure that we are proceeding in a way which is going to endure and come up with a robust answer, which, as we've just heard, is fair and equal for all sides.
Justin Madden.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Like all the members in here, I have veterans in my constituency who are very angry at the way this has been handled, and they're extremely concerned about issues being dredged up from 20, 30, 40 years ago in what they would consider to be an unfair manner. Obviously, there's been a lot of press speculation on this in recent days, and I have to say some mixed messages from the government, which has only increased the anxiety that many veterans feel. So what I want to ask the Minister, does he understand the concern that this is causing and the need for clarity and certainty and the need for this to be done as quickly as possible?
That's
right, Mr. Speaker, yes, yes, and emphatically yes.
Well done. Mr. Philip Holloway.
We're blessed in the borough of Kettering for having many veterans who served in Northern Ireland who are outraged at this process. And we have, on the one hand, a previous Labour government which has issued letters of comfort to known terrorists, and now a Conservative government effectively threatening prosecution to veterans, many of whom have faced court cases before. The Minister says he's had legal advice from the Northern Ireland office. Can he reassure the House that he's challenging that advice, not simply accepting it? And he said that Sinn Féin aren't pressing for these cases to be examined. He said he had no knowledge of that. Can he confirm 100% that Sinn Féin are not pressing for these veterans to be prosecuted as a condition of setting up the new Northern Ireland Executive?
Mr. Speaker, I'm not in that part of the talk, so as a matter of fact, I wouldn't be able to tell him one way or another. But what I can tell him, and this comes back to my earlier answer to my honourable friend from Rayleigh, is that rancid deals should have no part in how we treat our veterans in any case.
Simon Hall.
Mr. Speaker, can I tell my honourable friend that the best way for wounds to heal is to stop picking at the scabs? And we have to stop treating Northern Ireland as other. Military, police and civilians will have far greater confidence only when the rules apply globally. I see no merit in perpetrating the otherness of Northern Ireland and the rules should apply for our military, police and civilians, whether it's in Basra or in Belfast. The status of the unbalanced letters of comfort need to be reviewed and clarified as they distort the arguments. The balance of the scales of justice needs to be able to balance. These letters distort it beyond all chance of that happening.
Mr. Speaker, let me start by agreeing very strongly with the point about the scales of justice have to be able to balance. And it isn't just a question of balancing in one case or two. They have to balance for all cases, and they have to be seen to balance by all sides. And the reason we're all here today is because there is a widespread perception, and it's on both sides of the community in Northern Ireland, and that they are tilted for different reasons in different ways. So he's absolutely right to make that point. I would just remind him of my earlier answer, though, about the letters of comfort. Those letters have now been reviewed, and the latest legal report is that they do not, let me just repeat, they do not provide immunity from prosecution. They may not have ever been prosecuted, but they do not provide immunity from prosecution. The difference is that, therefore, were a case to be brought tomorrow, they would not be a piece of legal body armour. It is important that we make that point, Mr. Speaker, because I hope the message will go out loud and clear from this chamber that, therefore, anybody who thinks they can swan around scot-free as a result of that does not have the legal protection which some people may have thought they did.
Order. Right Honourable Gentleman for Chingford Willenford Grieve is hovering. Does he want to...
I wonder whether it would still be...
Well, I'm in a generous mood, and in recognition both of the Right Honourable Gentleman's military background and of his former leadership of his party, I think the House should indulge him. Mr. Ian Duncan-Smith.
Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful to you, and I apologise again. I came in as the Minister was on his feet. Can I just say to the Minister, I did serve in Northern Ireland. I also served in what was then Rhodesia. I got a General Service Medal for one and a separate campaign medal for the other. They were both operations, as our honourable friend has said, and we were sent to Northern Ireland, and I lost friends, and particularly Robert Nairac, who I'm sorry I wasn't able to be here for that. And I don't know how I can honestly, with a clean heart, say that my government represents the best interests of ex-servicemen and women who have served their country. I simply say to him this simple principle. When natural justice collides with the law, we change the law.
Well, and Mr. Speaker, that has to be correct. That's why we are talking about bringing forward an Act of Parliament, a bill, to this place in order to change the law, in order to put this right. And he is also right to say, and I think he's echoing the point made by my parliamentary neighbour, the MP for Wells, that to soldiers serving, if they get campaign medals or operation medals or whatever it may be, it feels the same whether or not the legal underpinnings for the operation that they are serving in are different. And therefore, we have to come up with a bill and then an Act of Parliament which ensures that the protections are the same, even if it is arrived at through a different legal route. But either way, it has to be, it absolutely, essentially has to be robust in the event of legal challenge. Otherwise, we will have failed in our duty to look after our veterans, no matter where they will have served.
Thank you.